You're listening to The Conversation. One evening in April 2024, Annabelle West closed a book and turned to her husband.
My wife was reading a book called The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt.
This is Peter Malinauskas, the Premier of the state of South Australia.
She finished the book, she put it down in her lap and she turned to me and said, "You better bloody do something about this."
Haidt's book about the damage social media is doing to adolescent brains suggested banning social media for under 16s.
We got to work thinking about how we could make a meaningful difference to protect kids from all the dangers that social media, unregulated, represents.
Malinauskas launched a summit, inviting Haidt to speak. Then a campaign began, led by News Corporation, which gathered political momentum until 6 months ago, in December 2025, Australia became the first country in the world to ban under 16s from social media. Now other governments are considering similar laws. In mid-June, the UK announced plans to introduce its own ban on social media for under 16s from 2027. Australia is the test case. So how's it going? Have the teenagers of Australia emerged from a phone-lit glow to re-engage in the real world? And what kind of difference is it having on their mental health? I'm Gemma Ware from The Conversation, a news and analysis platform partnering journalists with academics. Welcome to The Conversation Weekly, where experts explain how we ended up here. In this episode, does a social media ban really work? Susan Sawyer, you're a professor of adolescent health at the University of Melbourne and based at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, where part of your work is looking at the impacts of Australia's social media ban. Welcome to the podcast.
I'm delighted to join you.
So, Susan, it's been 6 months now since Australia became the first country in the world to ban under 16s from social media. How have those 6 months been for you, trying to track what's going on and being in the middle of it all?
I think it's been a bit of a roller coaster as we've all lived through what's been happening, what changes we've seen, what changes we haven't seen. And it's a very exciting time to be doing research in the area, I think is all I can say. It's been fascinating.
Because it's essentially a unique social science experiment that you're living through as well.
Certainly that's the language. When the legislation was first introduced, I was certainly describing it using those terms, that it was a social experiment on young people. I think I've since backtracked a little, to be honest, and realised that actually if we look at children's exposure to social media in general, that's the bigger social experiment. And I think that the belief that many people had that somehow there was this notion of tech exceptionalism and that social media platforms did not need a level of regulation that we expect in every other industry. I think that's been quite sobering to be thinking about how do we ideally make platforms safer. But given the degree of difficulty that countries have had in engaging with tech companies around that, what other strategies can be used?
Australia is to ban children from using social media. The legislation will impose and enforce a minimum age to use platforms like Facebook and Instagram.
If we go back to that time, I think I had very mixed feelings about it. Largely, and I think very consistent with many of the parents that we've surveyed, was the cynicism I think I had about the ability to actually get young people off social media. And to some extent, I think that's been fair cop. It has been pretty difficult, and Australia's E-Safety Commission, our independent regulator, is having to work incredibly hard with the various social media companies in relation to that. The E-Safety Commission is starting to introduce some deeper investigations into 5 tech companies that it feels have not taken sufficient steps in relationship to age assurance. So it will be interesting over the next couple of months as those investigations proceed.
Early research into the ban has found so far 70% of children still have access to at least one of their social media accounts.
Like many people at the time it was first introduced, I felt it was a bit of a blunt instrument. I had concerns that there were particularly some groups of young people more than others who might potentially benefit more from access to social media in terms of helping to find their tribe, identity formation, whether that's kids who are in more isolated communities, kids who might have mental health issues or who might identify as LGBTIQ+, for example. So I think I was a little bit concerned about how these particular groups might fare. But I think as time's gone on, my attitudes have changed. And I think broadly across Australia and indeed internationally, we're seeing that conversations are shifting from whether social media negatively affects young people or to what extent or in what ways, to rather thinking about what age might be a more appropriate age for young people to first gain access to social media.
Lots of other countries are now looking to Australia to see what happens, to see what's working. How do you even begin to start answering that question of whether this is working and rise above the anecdotes in some way?
Look, it's a very complex question. And I think, like you, the 6-month mark, everyone's asking, is it working? At the 3-month mark, everyone was asking, is it working? And I've been trying to say to every media outlet I've been speaking to, hold your horses. This is early days yet. It is going to take time. Many of us are involved with various studies that are aiming to try and understand the relative impact of the legislation, whether it's on young people, whether it's on families. And I've also really had the privilege of being a member of the Independent Academic Advisory Board that's working with Australia's eSafety Commission, that's overseeing a much larger government-led evaluation supported by Stanford University. A key part of it is a longitudinal study, having recruited just over 4,000 young people before the introduction of the legislation at the end of last year and following them over 4 follow-up occasions over the next 2 years. And so I think that 2-year timeline gives you some sense of the expectations of how long it is going to take for answers to appear.
So let's dig into some of the data that you've already got. So you've recently carried out a survey of just over 2,000 parents of 0 to 17-year-olds. What's that revealing about the ban so far?
I should start by saying that I think for any teenager who's had a couple of years access to social media, they're now 14 or 15, that I really think it's incredibly hard for those kids to lose access to a form of communication that it's just become second nature. And best case scenario, Australia's social media legislation will help change social norms around what parents think is an appropriate age for young people to access social media. And the evidence that we have from this survey of about 2008 parents of over 3,000 kids suggests that is happening. Basically, over a third, nearly 40%, are saying that the new law has changed their thinking about what the appropriate age is for kids to first access social media, and overwhelmingly that's now a higher age. When we actually asked parents what specific age do you think is the right age, there's this big step change at the age of 16, which again is suggesting the power of public policy. Changing social norms is really about what do parents think other parents are doing. 46% of parents of 10 to 15-year-olds said they either agreed or highly agreed with the statement that most parents are talking more about delaying social media access. And similarly, those parents, 58%, so nearly 60%, were saying it now feels more normal to set rules about my children's social media use. So again, data like that 6 months in gives me a lot of confidence that these perceptions about what is an appropriate age, what are other parents doing, what's the right thing to be doing, seems to be gaining traction among at least this sample of Australian parents.
What about those parents, when you ask them if they had children who had access to social media accounts, what did they say about whether those kids were still able to access those accounts?
That's been really interesting. So 3/4 have still got access to social media. So essentially only a quarter of kids who had previously had access to social media who should have lost it in terms of if the tech companies were doing the right thing, only a quarter of them have lost access to social media. So this is what's telling us that there is a long way to go in terms of eSafety's ability to achieve traction in terms of social media companies doing more. Many parents have been disappointed that even when they've tried to report their children's persisting access to social media companies, that they've got very little traction. The eSafety Commission didn't designate what companies should do, which age assurance technology they should use. But they were expecting a sort of a waterfall approach, if you like, where initially there would be age assessment using AI-based photographs, and then if you failed that, then it would be looking at some behavioural verification approaches, looking at the other social media sites that you might be on, and only then would it go through to some more formal age identification, which is in Australia is a little bit complicated because we don't have a universal identity card, for example. But with eSafety's compliance update, interestingly, they found that many young people were able to attempt to upload photographs of themselves that initially had failed to pass, but on subsequent attempts were able to pass, which was not at all of the intention of the legislation. You know, I think there's a lot of learnings for everyone within this.
It's interesting what you said about parents reporting to the tech companies that their children can still access this. So parents are trying to help the tech companies in some way comply. It's a weird one, isn't it? Because it's not against the law for the children to access it. It's the tech companies who are breaking the law.
The tech companies are required to comply. There is a national law in Australia, and they will be fined if they fail to take reasonable steps to comply. In terms of parent and adolescent behaviours, that's all around a notion of adherence, where you would like young people and parents to be adhering with the intention of the legislation. But absolutely, there are no fines if young people fail to follow that. And I think that, again, is appropriate that the weight sits with the tech platforms. And the parents in our poll, just to say, many of them said that the reasons that their children are no longer online is that they have removed their children's accounts, for example. A number of parents are being proactive in their engagement with their children's social media accounts to be reducing their access to social media.
Coming up, what the social media ban could do to young people's mental health. That's after this short break.
Hello, curious kids. Have you ever wondered how high a volcano can throw lava in the air? Or
why is it that when you're in a bath your fingers go wrinkly?
Or even,
will scientists be able to make a new element?
Well, you're in the right place. I'm Eloise and welcome back to Season 2 of The Conversation's Curious Kids, the podcast where an expert answers some of your most head-scratching questions. Listen to The Conversation's Curious Kids wherever you get your podcasts.
I know it's early days, but what do we know now from the evidence that we have about the way kids are feeling and approaching the ban?
So about 60% of young people were not supportive of the law when we asked them in the lead up to the implementation of the legislation. But I actually found that really interesting because whilst 1 in 8 of the sample said that they were supportive of the law, you know, that was pretty out there. 1 in 8 young people, teenagers, said they were supportive of this legislation. But 40%, including that 1 in 8, either were supportive of the legislation, didn't know what they thought, or it was sort of didn't care. So in that sense, I think we need to avoid listening just to the loudest voices. If you listen to the social media chatter, you would have believed, I reckon, that 95% of young people would have been against the ban, and that's clearly not been the case.
So, Susan, in a separate study, you've been tracking a group of kids in Melbourne since the age of 9, and they're now in their early 20s, and you've used this group to track the impact of their social media use on their mental health. What have you been finding in that study?
Yeah, so this is just, hot off the press, published in the Medical Journal of Australia. It's data from the child to adult transition study where we recruited just over 1,200 young Melburnians. We tracked them every year. There has been annual review of self-reported social media use and a range of self-reported mental health symptoms and outcomes. What we then asked, and this is like a hypothetical randomized controlled trial. So if we could convert all of the very frequent social media users, which in this study we defined as over 2 hours a day, to lesser social media users, under an hour a day, how many cases of poor mental health could we prevent? We were basically trying to ask, if Australia's social media legislation were to work, what hypothetical impact might it have on mental health outcomes? Because we don't expect that this is a silver bullet. We know that a number of politicians perhaps might be believing that social media has a more negative impact on young people's mental health than most of us believe it has. And I certainly believe that many parents might also have that belief. Most academics certainly don't hold that belief, but consistent with the evidence so far would suggest that there is at least some effect. And so what we basically found is that if you had 100 young people who were in the heavy social media use category, reduced them to low social media use, overall, and this was between the ages of 10 and 18 was the analysis, you would be able to prevent 6 cases of poor mental health, say high depressive symptoms.
So you were also looking at differences between boys and girls in this study. What did you find there?
So overall, we found that many more girls as a percentage were more frequent users of social media than boys at each age. But we found, and it's somewhat paradoxical, a higher impact of frequent social media use on boys' mental health. But the greatest population benefit would be experienced in girls because they have worse mental health and more frequent social media use. So this combination of factors gives a relatively greater protective benefit from reducing social media use in girls rather than boys. If we can get greater traction with more young people actually being pushed off social media, or indeed with the younger generation maturing, being older when they first gain access to social media, all things being even, our analyses would be suggesting that benefits would be gained in terms of young people's mental health.
Why do we think that age bracket, that 12, 13, 14-year-old age bracket, is so important for young people?
Yeah, this is a really important question. We know that puberty brings with it some remarkable changes in the brain in relationship to how young people interpret themselves vis-a-vis others around them. And so with the onset of puberty, which in girls is typically about a year earlier than in boys, it really brings with an exquisite capability for young people to be able to compare and contrast themselves. When I went to school, I might have been comparing myself to the other 100 kids in my year level of a country high school without social media, but our comparator now for 12 to 13-year-old kids is the millions and millions of kids across the world. And young people during adolescence feel a much greater threat from social failure, from not being part of the in crowd. Those sorts of social threats are experienced more negatively than are experienced by even adolescents a couple of years older than that, let alone by us as adults. And so it's the timing of puberty that is what is most important.
Given the signals that you're getting from the data we've got so far, this emerging data that we've got of the ban, what do you think longer term, if you look ahead, will be the biggest impacts as the months and the years tick by of this ban?
Yeah, I think the main reason that there was so much support for the ban by parents who really did at the time that the legislation was introduced overwhelmingly support the legislation was because I think really two things. One was the concern that parents had about the amount of time that their kids were spending on time and not doing other things, whether that was their homework, whether it was physical activity and sport, whether it was just engaging with their siblings and in family life. And certainly, we have some evidence already from our recent poll that suggests that parents are reporting that kids are spending more time being physically active, spending more time engaging with family, and that there are fewer arguments at home. But I think that more broadly the concern has been around young people's mental health and well-being. And so, one is hopeful that this might have a small impact. And we know that whilst there are still harms even for older adolescents, not to the same degree, nothing is going to magically change in terms of what young people are actually seeing online. And so I really do think that one of the things that we're hoping to change might be young people's mental health.
And a lot of other countries around the world are now looking to Australia to see what happens. What would your advice be based on the evidence we've got so far and your experience of living through these first 6 months about how to design a policy like this and what to look out for as you do it?
I think firstly is the recognition that most of the common social media platforms do not recommend that kids under the age of 13 should currently be on them. And yet we know from Australia, even before the implementation of the legislation, that overwhelmingly those kids who were on social media under 13, 80% of them had said that their parents had assisted them to get online. Certainly our data would be suggesting that, under the age of 13 you shouldn't be on social media, and that's consistent with current recommended practices. But I think that the other learnings that I think we have had is that the acceptance from parents about the implementation of legislation depends on the extent to which there is parent understanding of this, of schools' understanding of this. So in Australia, the fact that we do have in every state and territory legislation to be preventing kids at school from being able to access social media, and that as a result of the legislation that feels like there's greater traction and that schools have found it easier to implement that legislation, tells us something that I don't think any country should be implementing a ban or thinking about that in the absence of a really strong platform in relationship to what schools are doing. In addition to that, I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of building kids' digital literacy. And there's just been a recent survey in Australia, for example, that was really suggesting that only 37% of Australian students in year 10, so this is 15, 16-year-olds, reached the standard for digital literacy. The final learning, I think, for every country would be that this legislation has only been possible in Australia because of our independent statutory body, the eSafety Commission. There are only currently 8 others globally, so that without something like a body that could actually oversee this and really be able to work tightly with tech companies, such legislation will absolutely fail. But in all honesty, I really feel that until we are able to work more powerfully with social media companies to really prevent the algorithmic-driven approaches to engagement and also around what might be appropriate content, I'm not necessarily convinced that in any way this is going to be the silver bullet.
We've mentioned parents throughout this conversation, but we as adults, we've got a lot to answer for here, haven't we? And what do you think this legislation and the way it's working or not working tells us about just social media regulation more generally, of adults' use of social media too?
This is the piece that there's been far less discussion about in Australia, to be honest. How many hours am I spending on social media? But for parent modelling behaviours in front of their kids, it's essentially any screen time, because when we all have our heads in a screen, whether that's a phone, whether it's a computer, whether it's for work or not, it doesn't matter. But for children, that's time that their parents are not engaging with them. And we know that children and young people are social animals, and we learn by engaging with other young people and with adults around us. How much time are we actually getting out there to smell the roses? And, I mean that literally, whether it's being out in the fresh air, having a walk, doing something where we're actually having more meaningful connection. But, the data suggests for all of us that the more time we're online, the more lonely we are. And that's not just for young people.
Well, thank you, Susan, for telling us what we can know at this moment. And it'll be great to talk to you again in the future when we have a bit more data. So thank you very much.
I'd welcome the opportunity, Gemma.
That's it for this week's episode of The Conversation Weekly. You can read more analysis of young people and social media from academics around the world on The Conversation, and we'll put some links to further reading in our episode notes. This episode was written and produced by me, Gemma Ware, Mend Marawani and Katie Flood. Sound mixing is by Michelle Macklem, and our theme music is by Nita Saal. The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts with a wider audience. If you like what we do, please consider supporting us at donate.theconversation.com. Thanks very much for listening.
What are you going to have? Can I have 2 pieces of mullet, please? A piece of sea perch and 8 whiting fillets, please, Pauline.
From a fish and chip shop in regional Queensland
I believe we are in danger of being swamped by Asians.
to the heart of Australian politics, this is the unlikely story of the country's most controversial minor party.
Are you xenophobic? Please explain.
For 30 years, One Nation and Pauline Hanson have been ridiculed, dismissed and shut out.
Gone. I don't like it. No, I don't. Never did.
Now, no one's laughing.
One Nation continuing to surge in the polls.
Dramatic surge in support for One Nation. The fringe becomes the mainstream.
This is the story of how a party built on fear and grievance thrived, died, and rose again to upend Australian politics.
Well, I'm back.
Hanson 2.0 is the serious, strategic, experienced, battle-hardened political operator that we see in the news today.
I'm Ashlyn McGee. This is The Making of One Nation from The Conversation, and you can search for it wherever you listen to podcasts.